I just really try to make sure everything is connected. If there's something in nature, something in the wild, like I always use an owl because I think it's really tangible no matter if you're living out in the country or in an urban environment. Don't take away a job that something in nature is already doing for you.
Welcome back to the Beet Podcast. I'm your host today, Jacques, the Garden Hermit, and today we have a very special guest on, Angela Ferraro-Fanning, and you have a very interesting story. You've done a lot of really cool stuff, and I know you started off as beginning a homestead sometime around like 2012, but I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself and your journey into homesteading and everything else around it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm happy to be here. So I started out as an ornamental hobby gardener. I used to have a graphic and website design business, and I've always been eco-friendly. It was an eco-friendly graphic and website design business that I ran. And I found myself just getting so burned out on being behind the computer all day long. I wouldn't find myself. I did it on purpose. I would cancel my meetings to go outside if it was a nice day so I could be in the garden because I needed that connection. And, eventually after I had my first child, I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And so I decided to take my interest in gardening, which was largely ornamental, but I had a little vegetable plot, and say to my husband, could I teach myself to really grow our own food, preserve it, try to eat from the garden as best we can year round, do bees for honey, and trade in my paycheck so that I could be outside with my son, get out from behind the computer, experience the weather, experience nature every day, and grow food that I knew what was on it and what was in the soil that was around it. And he was really supportive, and he said, yes, we took that financial hit, we took a step back, and I started growing our own food. And then I found permaculture, which is this whole approach to growing where you're mimicking patterns in nature. And I started learning that animals and plants, they can work together. And before I learned that it was called permaculture, I was just calling it holistic homesteading. So when I learned that there was actually a name for this, I became so excited. I was reading all the books and listening to all the founders, and I just went off the deep end. And that's something that I've been practicing for years now.
Yeah, that's actually, all of that is really cool. It's actually something, I had a similar kind of feeling. I think actually a lot of people nowadays, as we've known, now that you've done it for a while, you've probably run into a lot of people who are like, wow, like that's something I think about all the time. But it's really interesting to see how people have been wanting to reconnect to like where food comes from and just spending time outside. Like even myself, like your story of trying to spend time outside is very familiar to me because when I was working on the PhD, I had one meeting once a week. So I would spend all the other days outside, just like gardening nonstop. Yeah. And then I would work for like one day to get ready for my meeting. Just say like, here's the work I did. And then I go back to gardening. And it's similar like thing where I just kind of like dove into it, started absorbing from all these different people who have been doing it for a long time and teaching and learning. And the more you learn about it, the more actually interesting and fascinating it becomes, because it's not just a like simple 1 + 1 = 2. It's like this whole journey of things that are connected and chained events as you're building out your garden and making all these different connections. And it's actually super interesting to hear that you started out from ornamental and then got into the vegetable. I don't know if I've met that many people who have done that path. Do you still do like a lot of ornamentals, or right now you're really focusing on like the food?
That's a good question. So we have 6 acres now. So I definitely have, hydrangeas, and I've got black-eyed peas in my front yard and that sort of thing. But I really feel passionately about, I'll grow flowers because I think they're beautiful and I like them. But if they're not doing something other than just attracting pollinators, right? They need to be doing more for me than that for the most part. So yeah, I planted the hydrangeas before I really got into this way of life. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that everything that I bring in now serves multiple purposes. Am I going to rip something out because I like hydrangeas and they're not doing that for me? No, I planted them before, I'll keep them. But now I make more conscious decisions and make more of an effort to make sure that everything I bring in is serving the greater ecosystem.
Yeah. It's like a really interesting approach too, because there is still ways to have ornamental like looks and beauty in the garden while still having a very useful, functional sort of ecosystem and planting out. So it's not
Yeah.
like they're mutually exclusive, just maybe like in the way that people think about it, like it's not going to be a hydrangea. It might be something else that provides beauty, but also has uses and brings in pollinators. So it's just interesting to think about like myself, I consider myself like a vegetable grower and a gardener, but I still do put out a lot of flowers. And for me right now, it is mostly for the pollinators and the looks, but I have been really interested in this path of really trying to understand the food system and how I could make my whole garden work together better. Because like what you said earlier is that you got interested in it because you also want to know what's going into your food. And
Yeah.
that was a huge thing for me. It's like the flavor of it, and also just knowing like literally nothing weird was sprayed or anything was sprayed on this because
Right.
I knew I grew it. I saw the whole process from seed to the final harvest. And there's something really magical and like powerful about that, that you get to actually have that control. So for me, like that's always been a major interest. So when you first started this journey, did you start with the goal of planting out like enough vegetables to feed your family? Was there like a certain plan that kind of got you started in that path?
Yeah, so when I started getting into this, we had 3/4 of an acre at the time. And I really started learning about growing up instead of growing out
Mm.
so that I could maximize my space. And at that property, I was taking out a lot of the ornamentals that the previous owners had planted and replacing those with edibles that were still beautiful, but that could provide fruit, like kiwi vines. I'm in zone 7, central New Jersey. And so I wanted something that was a climber. So it was like, okay, well, instead of just doing, like a climbing rose, for example, could I get something that's going to give me fruit? And so I really started learning not just about the direction I was growing in, upwards versus outwards, but also that replacing component. And then on top of that, I went further and started thinking about, okay, if I'm trying to be conscious about what I'm spending and also conscious about my time, I need to be planting more perennials. So I started learning about fruits
Yeah.
and vegetables I'd never heard of before that you don't see in the market because they don't tend to ship as well, post picking. And so I just really opened up my world to this whole new array of fruits and vegetables that I'd never heard of before that can be grown year round. You don't have to replant. And, of course, there's a whole onslaught of perks and benefits that come with planting perennials in
Oh,
a
yeah.
garden.
It's actually one of those things where I would like to do more research into that space because, like you mentioned, like there's a lot of benefit. Just not having to, like, if you have a section of your garden with perennial plants, you could just leave them there and you don't have
Yeah.
to think about what am I going to do there? Like,
Right.
am I going to plant something in there? It like frees
Right.
up your mind a bit
Or you
and
plant
you
in
still get the
between.
benefit.
Yeah, like just
Yeah.
today, I have I was just before we were chatting, I have this sort of food forest area where I have a fig and an aronia berry, and then I've got
Mm.
strawberries. And in between there, that's where I was planting my garlic and my shallot this morning because they have jobs, right? Garlic and shallots, they
Yeah.
tell a lot of things. And so I'm sort of fitting those in between. Whereas this season before that we're still just wrapping up now, I have cosmos that are still in there. So I know that I have flowers in there now that are attracting the pollinators, but next season it's going to be largely allium based. And so
Oh, I see.
yeah, it's
Like
giving
you're planting in between as they're
yes,
still growing. So you're already getting ready for that full
correct.
cycle
Because then
before it's even done.
right,
Yeah.
we're then incorporating crop rotation and I'm making sure that while this year I had pollinator attractors with my cosmos and they're still in existence, they haven't died back yet. Next year I've got the repellers, which are going to be my alliums, my garlic and my
That's
shallots.
cool.
And so everything has jobs. And I think one thing that's taken me just like a really long time to get my head around is that if a weed can fit in that space, you can grow something in there. So we were talking about perennials a second ago, and it's like, okay, if I have open ground space around an aronia berry, don't leave that open. I've started putting good King Henry spinach, which is a perennial in
Oh,
space.
yeah.
And I don't know. I could geek out over this stuff all day long.
I mean,
Love
I
it,
love it.
right?
I think it's super interesting because it's one of those things that it feels intimidating to start.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if this is your experience as well, but whenever I look at all these different options with like the perennial permaculture, like I want to get more specifically into the permaculture, but a lot of these plants are plants that are popular in the permaculture world. And I've always just kind of wondered about how do I balance everything out? Like if I'm planting something right next to my like aronia berry, like am I going to have this competition problem? And how do I balance it all? And I don't know if it's also the fact that where I'm at in San Diego, we just don't have rain. So if I plant things really close together, I have to make sure I have an irrigation plan because they're not going to get water for 8 months of the year. So that's like one of those things where I'm like constantly trying to think, how do I incorporate this more? And is that something like when you got into this, starting off with holistic homesteading, is that something that you kind of have learned over the years? Was it something that felt very natural at the beginning? Or was it you made a lot of mistakes along the way and now you're really kind of figuring it out? Like you have a good sense for it, it sounds like.
Thank you. I think, having gardened for a long time, the concept of growing things wasn't foreign to me. That being said, I focused solely on annuals in the beginning, right? We think about a vegetable garden, so we think about bringing in tomatoes and peppers and lettuce. And so for me, it was really this evolution of learning relationships between plants. And I can still remember the first time a neighbor had talked to me about the idea of companion planting and getting the book Carrots Love Tomatoes. And that was my first step into this holistic piece. And then my husband wanted eggs, and it was right around the same time I was like, I do not like chickens. I just don't like chickens. I don't want a chicken. And he's like, what about a duck? Which ended up really being serendipitous because here in New Jersey, we're a very wet climate. We have a lot of snails and slugs that just devour plants. And then when I saw the snails and slugs were getting eradicated by the ducks, I was like, that was a light bulb. And then I've got my companion plant book and I'm like, wait a second. I can be a facilitator rather than just micromanaging this. I can implement and it will self-maintain. And then that was just the end. Like that was the end and the beginning of it all, right?
That is like a really interesting thing to mention because it is, as a gardener, you're doing this dance. Like you're setting up all these different chains of events of setting up your annuals and planting them and knowing that I've got to stake and support this tomato. I've got to prune it regularly to keep it happy. Like it requires a lot of daily maintenance to really maintain an annual vegetable garden.
So much.
And keep it healthy. And especially if you want it to like look good, like you could just plant it and leave it and still harvest plenty. But if you really want to maximize it, it takes a lot of work. And that is something I don't really think about with this kind of more permaculture mindset of like you're setting up the first problem, maybe is one way to say it. Because I know that permaculture talks about problems as like solutions, right? So you have your first problem, which is like you're growing vegetables and now like it's attracting slugs. And what do I do? Then you could get the ducks. And then what do the ducks do? They eat the snails and the slugs and they keep your vegetables clean from those pests. And then now you get eggs. And in exchange, you have the protein now like from your property and you get their poop and you get to do something with their poop, which could then go back to the vegetable. It's like you can create these systems and they do sound like a lot of work, but maybe it's a lot of work in targeted periods instead of like every day you have to do a bunch of stuff. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what it seems like.
There's an observation period that has to take place, right? You have to identify sort of what these challenges are. And then there's always going to be a level of work and adaptation. You mentioned that you live in a very dry climate, and for the most part, New Jersey is a wet climate, except we're kind of experiencing these shifts now. And, we go through drought. Now we don't have anything like 9-10 months of drought, but we go 3 months, and that's something that the vegetarian
that's a problem
here is not accustomed to. So then I started having to look at that problem, and I implemented catchment ponds and rain barrel systems. But then I also had to think about my garden is on a slight slope. Water massively accumulates at the bottom, and it was rotting things out that I had tried to grow there. And I was like, wait a second, lavender's dying down here. But the things that actually need water are dying at the top of the hill because they're not getting the water they need. Swap that, and there's the solution, right? Now the lavender's happy, and the things that the water needs to be running down to and accumulating it is feeding those things down there. And I think there's always going to be a level of adaptation for anybody in any garden, especially as seasons change and, temperatures shift, but then also as we see new pests that we haven't had before.
Yeah,
Like
totally.
do you have harlequin bugs?
We do. Are they the ones that have like the weird thing on the back? Like they have it's
Yeah.
like two triangles or something.
Yeah, and
Um,
they're like orange and black, and they've showed up
yeah, they
here and I
haven't
haven't.
been in my garden, but I have seen them.
You have. So this
Yeah.
is new for us, and man, my brassicas, we are on the struggle bus. We're gonna get it. I know I'm gonna get it because it just means I'm not attracting the
Oh,
predator yet of that, right? I've got to figure out what the ecosystem
yeah.
balance is. But there's always something to learn, and I know as soon as I get that figured out, it's just gonna be something else, right?
Yeah.
So
But for me, that's what makes me love this.
yes,
Because my personality, if I figure something out, like I'm bored. Like when I used to play video games and I would put like cheat codes in, I'm like, now I don't want to play this game because it's too easy. Like I've lost all will to play because like now there's no
yeah,
purpose. And for me, like the garden is so much fun because it really is like a daily challenge. And
yeah,
it's not like sometimes it can feel like a lot, like in the August, it feels like, oh man, like do I really want these tomatoes? but,
yeah,
uh, but it is worth it and it's fun and it's a mental game. And that to me is what I think makes it such a beautiful and like impactful, healthy thing for us as well, is that
mhm,
it is a challenge and it forces us to think outside the box to find these problems. And I think even for gardening, like what you said, like observing your area and understanding your garden can really change how you interact with it. And I'm
yeah,
actually happy that I built my garden over the course of like really 3 years. And now I've kind of run out of space. But over that time, I'm like, okay, I know this part of my garden gets the coldest. It's the only place where I see frost actively on my plants. So
oh,
that is going to be where I put my hardneck garlic. And I like to keep it on that side because it gets a little bit chillier than the other side of my garden. And I
yeah,
know that like that corner over there gets plenty of sun in the summer, but in the winter time, the sun is so low that it gets barely no sun. So I can't really put anything there that requires a decent amount of sun. Like last
yeah,
year, I put my garlic there. And while garlic can tolerate some stuff, not having sun in its initial growing period is not great. So it's stunted. So now I know, like, I'm not going to put garlic there. I'm going to put like some
mhm,
leafy greens. And that's really just part of the challenges and the fun of observing and learning your property and figuring out like where is that dry area that my lavender will thrive. I keep putting
right,
time in like these low areas where I'm like, why is it not doing well? Like, well, because like that's probably the wettest section of my garden.
right.
Um, so it's just adapting to what you see and what you hit along the way as you're building and learning your property.
I think with that as well, then like you started doing with your hard nut garlic, you can start manipulating your spaces. And so say for
Mm,
example, in your case, you start creating these microclimates, right? Like you knew where your frost was, or if you thought, for example, it's getting too hot, I need to create a cooler region for, I don't know, like maybe you wanted to grow brassicas or something.
yeah.
You can start bringing in shade trees, and then you really start having a hand in creating these little climates, which I think is such a powerful tool that a lot of people don't really know that they can shape and do, and that is totally at your disposal, even with just a mandala garden. When you have this mandala shape and you plant tall things, even if it's just as tall as an indeterminate tomato or a pepper on the outside, the inside now, if especially if you're in full sun, stays warmer and you've retained heat. And so you create this microclimate just with a mandala shape. And it's just really cool to be able to learn those things. And I guess that comes with experience, right? In the will and the want to gain that knowledge. But it's really powerful what you can do with what you grow, where you grow it, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, it's actually something I've played with a bit. And I think for it to really have its best chance is you have to loosen up on how you're planting. Like if you're planting in straight lines and in grids and squares and rectangles, you are going to be like a little bit inherently limited. You could still do something like planting taller stuff on the edge of like a raised bed and then putting stuff on the inside. But one thing
Sure.
that I've done over the summer, for example, is I'll put my tomatoes and I'll make it so that the north side of my tomato planting is going to be more shaded. And then I'll
Yeah.
put my lettuce down there at the base of my tomato plants. So even in the summer, I could still get the lettuce to not taste like crazy bitter and gross, and it'll
Yeah.
still grow and produce without bolting.
Yeah.
So like you could totally, like you're right, like you can definitely adapt down all these different ways of thinking, but you just have to, like, it's not going to be on the back of a packet or in every book that you ever see, or, you know, like it's subtle things that there's things that I do in my garden that I don't think I even mention I'm doing them even as I'm recording videos, because I've already thought about it so much that I have to remind myself to explain why I'm putting this here in this specific way. It's because I'm thinking about how big is it going to get? And when it gets that big, what is going to fit behind it? And can I squeeze something else in there and make that work? Even just getting like the timing, like you said, I actually snuck in some brassica plants in between my peppers, and then they're now able to start growing. And then in the end of this month, probably I'll end up pulling my peppers, and then now the brassicas will have already like gotten a foot tall, and then they'll just explode because I'll free up all that space.
Right.
And you don't have to start from a clean slate. Like it's just you just have to accept it and accept that you're not going to have like clean, perfect transitions, and like you're going to have a little bit of like stair stepping and maybe things that aren't considered the most inherently aesthetic at the beginning, but they will get there, and you just have to buy yourself that time. And I think it's important because it's like, I'm growing food because I want to grow food. Like I want to eat it. Like I want to educate and show people a pretty garden too. But like my main goal, honestly, is for me to eat my vegetables. So, like that is my main goal. That is why I started the garden. And if I don't get that, then I don't want to do this anymore. So like that is my, like, I want to teach people about more things, but I also love tomatoes. So I'm going to have 30 tomato plants, even though I can't make all my videos about tomatoes.
Right.
I want to talk a little bit about like your journey into the permaculture and why you wanted to go that way.
Yeah. So one of the biggest things for me is I have a lot of food allergies, and it has to do with a lot of sprays, a lot of pesticides. And that's one of the big drivers for me growing my own food. And a lot of the time, even the sprays that are dubbed organic, they're still not flawless and totally clean. And so I wanted to get away from that altogether. And so you combine that with this idea of having not just like a duck that you bring in, something domestic, but also the surrounding wildlife around you do jobs for you. I just found that to be really, really empowering. And so I started looking at, okay, how do I retain more praying mantises, for example? Because if I'm not, and I refuse to spray anything on my lettuce, I need something that's going to control the pests. You know, I touched on this harlequin bug thing before.
Yeah.
What's going to eat that? And what is going to create, or what's going to reduce the problems? Because even though I am the gardener, the grower, the farmer, I don't want to be out there fighting Mother Nature all day, every day. It's a losing battle. So, you know, I started planting more perennials, not just because they're so good for the soil and you don't have to plant them every year, but because those create shelters and spaces for birds that prey on a lot of these pesky insects. But they also harbor egg casings for praying mantis. And now I have them everywhere. My blueberry bushes, my aronia berry bushes, they are full of egg cases from praying mantis, and they're in my garden constantly. And the insect population, the pest population, has plummeted between the praying mantis and the birds. So when I started discovering these things, it's just continued to build, you know, and it's not just about the pests, it's about how do I fortify the soil and how do I build good soil structure. And so that comes with compost. And then okay, what can I use that is going to help me create compost? I don't want to buy it. So I've got sheep, I've got horses, and they do other things on a greater scale, you know, for each other when it comes to grazing in the pastures. But my horses pull. They help me bring in harvest because I go grow pumpkins in my cedar forest. They climb the trees, they ride up the trees. And so I, you know, put them in the wagon and the horses help me pull that in. I just really try to make sure everything is connected. You know, if there's something in nature, something in the wild, like I always use an owl because I think it's really tangible, no matter if you're living out in the country or in an urban environment. Don't take away a job that something in nature is already doing for you. So let's say you have mice. Well, you're not going to want to stock up on like 50 barn cats if you have a high owl population, because then what's going to end up happening is these cats are going to eat all their food, or they're going to kill off all of their prey, and the owls are going to leave. So you want to make sure that everything is a balance. And I think we forget that, right? Because I think as humans, we think, well, I want it to look this way, or I want it to be this way. But there's already so many inhabitants and so many things that have been naturally occurring before I moved to the property or before you moved to your house. And so I think we have to keep those things in mind. So by inviting, hanging sparrow houses, for example, in every apple tree, and making sure that they take up residence, they're eating the worms and the codling moth larvae that are infecting that. And am I even answering what you originally asked me?
No, I think I love this, and please keep going. And the original question was how you got into actual like permaculture, but this is I have so much I would love to continue this. So like, let's continue this train.
Okay, so yeah, basically it's just through the constant observation and identification of challenges and problems and saying, okay, well, what can I bring in or attract, or maybe even in some cases, what can I remove that maybe I shouldn't have brought in? That's going to help Mother Nature just sort of help reestablish itself. And then it just becomes a constant evolution. And honestly, it's an addiction. It's like so gratifying,
Yeah.
and so empowering,
Just to touch on all that, it's one of these things I've talked about, because both Kevin and myself, I think we both started traditionally gardening. So
Yeah.
synthetic this, synthetic that, like, oh, there's pests, I have to spray it. That's what
Yeah.
you do.
Same.
And very quickly, like, I think literally within the first year, I don't even think I even made it a full like growing year. I was like, this seems really ridiculous. Like, I have to go out here and you're telling me if I want to grow this, I have to dump this blue liquid on this plant like every week. Like, that's
Yeah.
insanity. And then I was
Right.
like, now I have all these aphids. I'm like, what do I do with that? So then you spray that and then something else shows up. And then you realize you're like, it's literally a losing battle. Like, there is no point in engaging in this war. And it's why, like, you look at a garden, it doesn't look anything like a commercial row farm. It's just like straight dirt lines and just the same plants, because that's the only way you could beat it. You have to have like entirely, and it's beating it. I don't even know if they're beating it. They're constantly battling and adapting, but you have to have a clean slate with as little variables as possible in order to even venture into that battle. And so very quickly, I was like, you know what? I'm over. I don't want to buy this stuff anymore. I don't want to apply it. I don't even know what it's made out of. And I just kind of stopped.
Yeah.
And maybe for like that first year, there was like a lot of damage. There was a lot of pests all over the place. And I was just kind of rolling with it. But over time, it reached a balance. And yes, I still get a little bit of pest pressure, but it's not even to the point where I care. Like, my biggest pest pressure is the roly-polies, the pill bugs. They'll eat my seedlings. So I've adapted. Now I transplant. I don't direct seed. So I direct seed, they're going to get eaten.
Yeah.
And that's as simple. Like, what am I going to do? Sift my soil and remove all these roly-polies?
Right.
Like, no
Right.
way. And like the birds, like, there's way more birds in my yard now because there's caterpillars for them to eat. And I've even seen like the goldfinches like picking at aphids, and like things will come. If you remove all the food sources, why would they show up? Like, why
Right.
would a ladybug come to your yard if you have zero aphids for them to eat at all? So
Right.
it's like, it's not like my entire garden's covered in aphids. It'll be like one plant maybe has a couple aphids on the leaves. Eventually I see a ladybug and the problem sort of resolves itself. So I think
Awesome.
there is a tendency to overreact. And even what you mentioned about like the owl, it's kind of morbid, but I was thinking about it. And this last year, we had an insane amount of hawks, red-shouldered and red-tailed hawks, and they're just screeching all spring long. And I started seeing them with rodents in their talons all the time. Like, they'd fly, even out of my garden, I'd walk out, all of a sudden like a hawk flies out, and it's got like a rat over mouse in its talons.
That's
And I was like,
amazing.
that's amazing. And yeah, I was like, incredible. And I'm like, please stay here, move in. I'll
Yeah.
give you whatever I don't want to give you anything because I want you to take it from my garden. But at that same time, it was post pandemic when a lot of our stray cats disappeared because I think the coyotes moved in and the city wasn't moving them anymore.
Oh.
So I've been seeing less stray cats. And in exchange, now that you mentioned that, I'm like, there was a lot of hawks this year and they were eating mice. So it is totally true. Like, there
Yeah.
is this balance. Like, obviously as humans, we could create an oversupply of a problem. Like, if I had a huge pile of food waste sitting in my yard, there'd probably be more rats than any hawk could eat. But it's all about that balance, and it totally does work. And you just have to kind of find it. But battling it is a disaster.
You touched on it though as well. You said, when you stopped spraying things and you decided you weren't going to do this anymore, there was a period of time where you this transition, right? Where you saw these pests, and I think that's where people freak out.
Yes.
But the idea is with the garden, it's not supposed to be a sterile growing environment, right?
No.
And I'm not sure how that mentality came to be where it's supposed to be really sterile and it's supposed to be removed from nature. There's nothing more natural than growing your own food. They're plants.
Yeah.
And I don't know, you're supposed to be attracting insects, you're supposed to be attracting pollinators, and you're supposed to be creating this ecosystem. Soil in itself is this incredible ecosystem. And so I don't know, I think it's just good for maybe folks to just remember you are supposed to have bugs. It's okay.
Yeah, I still have them now.
Yeah,
like it's
same.
not like I saw a tomato hornworm. It's like my tomatoes aren't decimated. Like whatever. Like
Yeah.
eat those leaves. Like I'm
I
not
think
gonna freak out.
maybe social media had something to do with that, right? You have these beautiful baskets of these perfect kale and lettuce leaves without any holes from bugs, but really we should be questioning why are there no holes in those leaves? Why are they so perfect? What are you spraying on that? And
Yeah.
there's some granted nobody wants to eat something that's infested with insects on it. We don't.
No.
But
No, but like a couple holes in the leaves, who cares?
that's natural, right?
Yeah. And when I go out there and I'm like, wow, like nothing's eating this kale, I'm like, cool. Like right now it looks good. But then like next week I might come out there and it might be like no leaves.
Yeah.
And I just remove them and then it grows again and
Yeah.
whatever. It's fine.
Right.
But it is, I think you're right. Like I remember reading this story. Somebody posted that they were so proud they grew like a tomato on their balcony, and they bring it in and they're cutting it up for like a meal, and their boyfriend's like, "What are you doing?" They're like, "I'm cutting up this tomato that I grew." He's like, "You can't eat that." They're like, "What do you mean?" They're like, "It's not sterile." And they're like, where do you think tomatoes come from? He's like, "I don't know. Like they grow them in like sterile environments, and then they get shipped to the store, and they're already like clean and ready." I'm like, my God, like
I know.
the disconnection of like, even myself, when I first started gardening, my parents grew up gardening, but they were like, they grew what they wanted. They had tomatoes and that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
My mom had some flowers. So even when I first started even growing like beans, I don't even like to admit it now because like, but I was like, wow, that's how beans grow, I guess. Like it was just like a novelty.
Right?
Because I'm like, I never get exposed to it. And
Yeah, that's
like,
awesome.
but like when you see a Brussels sprout, it's like, the first time I saw it, I think was at Trader Joe's because they sell them on the stalk sometimes.
Stock.
I was like, what the heck? Like, that's where Brussels sprouts come from?
I know.
And you don't know because you're not exposed to it.
I know.
And I think that's one of the things I'm most grateful for in having the garden is now I truly understand when I see something. Like I went to the farmer's market and I was like picking up some potatoes. I was like, oh, these potatoes are fresh. And he's like, how'd you know? He's like, I just picked them yesterday. And I was like, they're like really firm. Like they feel really incredible. And he's like, yeah, like they are fresh potatoes.
Yeah.
And it's like, now I know, like I could go out there and I can understand like the food world around me. And I think it's one of the like little gifts that you get from gardening. There's many that you get.
Yeah.
But it is like a really cool thing.
It's funny you mentioned the potato at a farmer's market because I have a similar story where once I hadn't grown potatoes that year. And so I went and bought a little basket. And as I set it on the counter he had to pay for the potatoes, one fell out, one on the ground. And he was really kind. He picked it up for me and he looked at me and then he's like, I mean, they grow in the ground. Can I put this back in the box? And I was like, well, yeah, of course you can. And he goes, okay, thanks for being a cool about it. Most people will not want me to put it back in the box. And I'm like, this is something that is grown in the soil. Like,
Yeah.
put
It's so
back
silly.
there. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. I'm like, instead,
Yeah.
it's like you go to the store and it's like the tomatoes are like covered in like mineral oil so that
Yeah.
they look shiny and they last
know.
longer. I'm like, you want that instead?
I know. It's just crazy.
I know but it's like what we've been taught. So it's like if that's what you grew up around and you're comfortable with it, then like you have to somehow break that. And
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I guess I was willing to break it, so it was easier for me. But actually, total tangent back, circle back. One of the interesting things you mentioned with like the trees and like microclimates and all that. Sorry, this is crazy reverse tangent back to that
Yeah.
conversation. But I was just looking at my fruit trees, and it's actually something that I started this year. Is I've been planting deciduous fruit trees in my garden.
Cool.
And with that same idea in mind of knowing that okay, in the summertime, they're going to be fully leafed out, but maybe that's fine because most things will be totally fine with some amount of shade. And in the wintertime, they'll lose their leaves. And now I will get all the sun back down to to the floor where I can now plant other things and they'll thrive.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things where I don't know what triggered me to think about it. Maybe I saw somebody else mention it. But I was like, oh, duh. Like, I could totally do that and not lose much at all. And now I get to harvest delicious fruit that I thought I didn't have space to grow.
It's awesome.
So you also mentioned like the sort of interplanting with permaculture. Do you get into like the guild planting a lot? Like, is
Heavily.
that something that you follow? Yeah.
Yes.
So can you explain like what a guild is really quick and maybe give us an example for other people to understand?
Yeah, so a guild is this idea of companion planting. Well, let's take an apple tree, for example, and you say, all right, immediately surrounding the apple tree, I'm going to plant a bunch of companions that help support the tree. And so you might have something that's a pollinator, something that's going to repel unwanted insects or even sometimes for trees, disease. Then you're going to have nutrient accumulators, things like comfrey that have really long taproots and pull nutrients up from deep within the soil. Because in comparison, the apple roots are more shallow. So now we're making them more readily accessible. And then we're going to have things like mulchers. Comfrey is another one that you can chop and drop and just spread around, and you can return those nutrients to the soil. And then we have weed suppressors. And then we also have, let's see, I did repellers, pollinator attractors, nutrient accumulators, nitrogen fixers. So you might have something that's in the legume family.
Okay.
And when you plant all of these things, you create this neighborhood, this little network that immediately supports the fruiting tree. And that doesn't mean like if you grow lemongrass or lemon balm or something like that around your tree that you can't harvest from it. You absolutely can. But the idea is just that we're facilitating relationships that support that main tree. And then one thing that you can do to take it a step further is connect your guilds together to start creating a food forest. So you have your apple tree with its guild, and then you plant your pear tree with its guild, and you can even have shrubs in between, like a caneberry, or I mentioned an aronia berry or a blueberry. And that's how you start creating these food forests, is you're connecting these companions together. So that's something I heavily practice here, yeah.
I think when I think about like companion planting, I think the thing that the guilds like take it up a notch is that I'm not so much thinking about where they're interacting at the soil level. So like you were mentioning, like the apple tree, like most trees in general have most of the roots on the surface. And I think a lot of people think that they're like super deep. So when you're planting something like that comfrey, like it's not really competing on the same level, right? Because the comfrey is sending its roots like straight deep down.
Yes.
So like they can coexist and help each other without competing against each other in that sense.
Yeah, and I think, with this whole competition concept, I think if you have good nutrient-dense soil, you should not have to worry about competition. If your plants are struggling because they're quote-unquote competing, you don't have nutrient-dense soil. And so that's where we get into, you need to be having, compost as a conditioner, making compost tea, throwing other plants in there that are pulling nutrients up from deep within the soil. The ground should be able to support multiple plants planted closely. If we look in nature, we look at a forest floor, it's never vacant, right? We never have a tree that is just bare with soil underneath. It'll have some undergrowth. Minimally, it could have some sort of, I don't know, like, let's just say it would have some sort of like a nettle or something under there out in nature. It could be a wild grass. It could be an orchard grass. Mother Nature wants the soil to be covered at all times because it prevents erosion, it prevents solarization, and it retains all the nutrients. And so when we replace weeds that are naturally going to grow because Mother Nature wants to put something there with plants that can help support the tree, we can start making use of those relationships by harvesting multiple things, helping to feed and interconnect the dots between the different plants. But then also you're doing all those things that Mother Nature does, right? But yeah, it's pretty cool when you start doing that, connecting them together.
Yeah. I think maybe I just realized when you're talking about the competition, it's something I think about a lot because most of my planting is annuals. And I was just thinking a lot of the stuff that you're putting as perennials within those guilds, like they have the time to really get comfortable, establish, send out a root system, start shading each other, providing all that. But like popping an annual in, it might only be growing for 3 months. And so it's really got to like make it or break it in that time period.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where like some of those challenges become more prevalent in like traditional gardening thinking. At least, I don't know. Maybe that's how I'm thinking about it is I could put a bunch of stuff closer together like that, but I'd have to support it more at the beginning, especially if they're annuals.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's like you can't just put stuff in and expect it to just magically work. You have to watch it and adapt to the situation.
Yeah. Well, and too with regard to annuals, all annuals, typically speaking, they're going to be developing at the same pace. Some grow a little faster than others, and their root systems are going to reach similar depths, whereas a perennial is going to grow much deeper and sink itself much lower and wider and has a much more diverse plot of soil to choose from for its nutrients than just an annual.
Like
and on
a
top
little
of that,
fistful of roots.
right. And on top of that, those perennials, they sink into that mycorrhizal network, right? They become part of the surrounding fungi. And if that
Yeah,
plant
and support
needs something, right, the mycorrhiza is going to go get it. Whereas an annual doesn't have enough time to really establish itself
Yeah, that's a good point.
as deeply. So yeah, I'm definitely a big fan of intermixing, the two.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. Definitely something that I want to consider more. I do want to touch on your animals a little bit.
Okay.
I know that we touched on the ducks a bit.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear how you make use of like sheep and horse. The horse for transportation sounds like is a big one.
Okay.
But I'm sure you also make plenty of use to enrich your soil from their manures.
Yeah. All right. So let's take the permaculture pathway through the animals and how I brought everybody in, how I convinced my husband to let me have a farm full of animals.
That's the key.
So we got the ducks, right, initially as our pest control means and for eggs. But here in New Jersey, I don't live by New York City. I don't live by Newark. I'm actually in a very agricultural forested area. We have black bear. We have a lot of predators.
Oh, cool.
And so I needed something that was going to keep these ducks safe because I want them to free range and forage through my growing spaces. So I started with geese. And the initial thought was they can't physically fend off a fox or a coyote, but I'm outside all the time. They can sound their alarm. We can also get eggs. We can breed them. So I started getting some rare heritage breeds and trying to help repopulate them and bringing in income for the farm. And then I thought, along with that, geese weed. They go through and they eat grass around fence posts. And they're called weeder geese for a reason. They have a preference for eating things I don't eat and that I don't want to mow or cut back or whatever. So give them that job. And
interesting.
Yeah, so they started performing all of these tasks for us. But then we had a fox who moved in and became too comfortable and brazen, and she would steal the birds right out from under me. I would be right there. And so this was not working. And I'm not going to trap the fox. I'm not going to remove the fox. So what do? I get a livestock guardian dog. And the dog communicates the boundary line between, where my animals are and their living space and where the wildlife can exist. So that's that little train. Then meanwhile, we have the 6-acre farm that we moved to, and I'd always loved horses. I love riding them. But now with this new whole permaculture lifestyle I'm getting into, I'm thinking, I'm not just going to ride the horse. I'm going to teach myself to drive it, and I'm going to work with it. So in our fields, I take a drag and I flip it teeth up since we're no-till and I don't want to disturb the soil, but I need them to drag out their manure. And so I use them for that. I use them for pulling, I use them for riding, and I use them for their manure. I take it and I hot compost it so that it can be used quickly in my growing spaces, in my guilds, and in my gardens, and my food forests. Well, one of the little offshoots of that is with the horses, I like to rescue horses that are up for auction or on their way to slaughter. And typically these aren't the healthiest of creatures. So I brought in this old guy, this old Clydesdale, and he had a lot of worms. And so I'm not really liking the idea of constantly giving this horse a dewormer. You know, it does a lot of bad things for dung beetles and the surrounding environment. So I'm like, there's got to be another way. If you co-species graze, they interrupt each other's parasite life cycle. So when you rotationally graze and put the horses through and they go through an area and they move off, their parasite eggs are shed in their feces. But then when the sheep come through, they're eating another portion of the grass and they're accidentally ingesting a lot of that larva, or a lot of the eggs. And by the time the horses go through my pastures and get back around to that one after it's rested, we've eradicated the parasites. So I no longer have to use any dewormers because the horses ingest parasite eggs that infect the sheep, and the sheep do the same for the horses. And I also put my birds through there, and I have guinea fowl, and they tear up this, the manure, and they expose it all to the soil, and we have no parasites here anymore. I've
That's
had
really cool.
egg counts run. I do not use dewormer. We are parasite free.
Wow.
So
I had no idea that that's how it even, like, that they were so species specific.
I didn't either. But the same relationship is for cows and goats.
Yeah.
But then, with the sheep, obviously, we got them for that. That was the primary thing. But I take their wool because they have to be sheared, and I do send it off to a mill, and we get yarn back. And I taught myself to knit a sock, and
Nice.
I mean, that takes forever. I mean, but I did it. But you could also use wool in the garden as a natural for mulching and deterring some pests. And so that's our little ecosystem. So nothing comes in here that's not going to contribute to the greater whole. It has to all come back to my growing spaces, and it has to help to benefit the animals as well. So that's our ecosystem.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Thanks.
And again, like, this isn't something you built overnight. This was over years, and and then you're learning along the way, and you're presenting these challenges, and you're finding solutions, and the solutions are oftentimes like great benefits in the end. So that's super cool to hear about that entire journey. Something that at some point I would love to have some more space where I could really play with these ideas more. It's an excuse. I could play with it here too. But to like fully restart and like try something a different way, I would definitely do things a little bit differently. I would try to think more intentionally about perennial plantings within the garden. And I have added some, but this is giving me a lot of food for thought, and it's really fun to hear the whole journey for yourself and what you've learned along the way. So it's been really great chatting with you, Angela. And I don't remember if I actually said at the beginning, but you could be found at Axe and Root Homestead.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Axe and Root Homestead.
Yes. Axe and Root Homestead on on Instagram. You also have like your website and your blog, and all over. So definitely check out Angela. She's, as you guys have heard, very interesting, cool stuff that she's working on.
Thank you.
And it was really fun chatting with you. Like, this was a really fun conversation.
I appreciate so much. I'm so happy to be here. If people are into permaculture and guilds, I also have my book, The Sustainable Homestead, which goes through all different sort of recipes. If you have an apple tree, you want to know what you can plant around it. If you have a pear or quince or whatever. So everything that I've sort of learned, this is my resource base
amazing.
On that. Yeah.
We'll definitely put a link in the description, and you guys should definitely check it out. I'm actually going to pick up a copy myself because I love reading gardening books, and I could always learn more. Yeah, thank you for being on, and it was a pleasure chatting.
No, the pleasure's mine. Thank you.